Alright, good day to you guys. Today I'll be going over the Class 4 restoration technique. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. So Class 4 restoration is essentially whenever you lose the incisal corner, either it's chipped off or you're opening up a Class 3 and it gets so big on the incisal aspect that you say, gosh, you know, this thing is going to have undermined enamel on the end and it's going to probably fracture the minute that the patient walks out the door. So there's several ways to do it. You can freehand it, which is what I did a couple of those the other day. It took longer than the method that we're going to show you today. You can also do a take an impression and alginate and do a wax up, which is kind of what I'm about to show you simulates. So I had this tooth here. I replaced the existing tooth, which has the prep on it, which I've already done a little bit there, already prepped out a little bit there on the for a Class 4. So you can take an alginate impression of whatever the patient walks in with and then wax it up. Then on your wax up you can make a PVS index, which is what this is. This is essentially think alginate but more durable and really hard. The only trick whenever you make this is in the laboratory is you got to make sure that it fits in with the rubber dam in place. So anyway, we're going to try this in just to make sure it fits. I already did earlier, but just to show you guys, so it covers just barely the incisal edge there. Okay, so ask for instructions on how to do this and set this up in the mouth, and it'd be easier to make the putty index with the rubber dam already on. Just lubricate the rubber dam really well before you do it. So if we pretend like this is the wax up on stone model, then we go back to the mouth will have the actual circumstance, which is going to be this big old fat you know, lesion or chip or whatever you want to call it here. Okay, so I've already taken the liberty of prepping out. I took just one of my Class 3s and prepped it a little bit bigger, which is generally, you know, what you'll have if you have a Class 3 and you need to take out that incisal corner. You just kind of go straight down, take out the incisal corner, and then that turns it in from a Class 3 to a Class 4. So I'm going to go ahead and screw in tooth here. I wanted to show y'all. So you can also do, if you don't want to do an alginate impression, pour it up and then do a wax up, you can also do a mock up in the mouth, which is essentially if the patient comes in like this, you can add composite in this area here and then take a putty impression of that. So you basically quote wax it up to ideal with old expired composite in the mouth, then take a putty of that. You can also do where you take a PVS impression or a putty index of this, and then in your PVS impression you'll have a positive where this space is right here, and you can carve that out either with a 15 or a 12 or a 25 blade or even a burr. I've done that before, where you use a burr and you carve out, you know, you kind of eyeball between say like 8 and 10. Okay, this is where the incisal edge needs to be. You eyeball that, and it takes a little bit more finishing, but that's a nice, easy, that's probably the fastest way of doing it. So we can see here the space that our filling is going to occupy. Now the lecture is really good. The only thing that I would add though is before we fill, I would add in a piece of this Teflon tape, which I've told a couple of you guys about, but I'm going to show you why. So the Teflon tape, we won't need to pre-wedge before we add in the Teflon tape and drape it, because the contact's been opened up by the absence of the incisal edge. So I'm going to go ahead and put this Teflon tape in. And drape it. And tuck it in a little bit there. Okay. So this is the point where you would go ahead and etch and bond. your etch prime bond, your restoration in, the Teflon tape protects the adjacent tooth from the effects of the etchant and the bond, so you won't have an erroneous bond to the adjacent tooth. Now the thing about the Teflon tape and why it's so nice is because it fits perfectly into this putty index and it won't mess up the putty index. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit and we're pretty much ready to start adding composite in. I'm going to try to keep the type it on like this. I'm trying a new technique that a D1 told me the other day to try, where I kind of work behind the camera. So we're just going to use A2D on the composite warmer here. I'm going to get a little bit of flowable as well. This is Starflow. We have Permaflow, but it's all the same. So essentially on the first increment, we're going to add either some flowable composite or some paste composite and should probably mark, because you know sometimes it gets confusing when you're looking. I'm just going to score this a little bit there just to show what tooth we're working on. So you can either add in flowable down on the lingual index or the lingual part. We're going to make a lingual shell and we're going to use this to guide us, because if we try to freehand it, it'll take forever, essentially is the reason why. So once we add the lingual shell, we can take off this index and then sculpt it by hand, but in order to save just a ton of time, that's why we're using this putty index for the lingual shell and the incisal corner for that matter. So just to keep things really nice and traditional, I'm going to use paste composite for this portion here. As you can see, after we've heated it, it's really nice and flowy. And then I'm going to just make sure that it goes down into the appropriate areas on the lingual. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that it bonds to some part of the prep on the lingual, which is beveled at a 45-degree angle. So we overbulk it a little bit there. And then we put it in place. Now I'm just going to sneak in here a little bit and make sure that we have some part of the paste composite that's sticking to the tooth itself. Okay, so this is important. On natural teeth, you can cure right through on the facial. On this, go right into the embrasure, because there's no way, there's not really any ability to get light through there. So we need to come through the embrasure. And then, kid you not, as soon as you take the lingual, the index off, come back and cure it some more, just to make sure that we've got it cured on the lingual. So you can see how the lingual looks. It's overbulked a little bit, but that's okay. We're going to come in and cure on the lingual. Notice that we still have the Teflon tape in place. Okay. So once you have your kind of your shell here, now you can start thinking about, okay, I'd like to put on a little bit of Dentin Shade. And remember, the way that the tooth goes is, and remember your translucencies, is the dentin will come down to about right here. So really, we're not going to have that much in the way of Dentin Shade. but we'll have a little bit on this one. This one here. So this is Dentin Shade, the one that we were using earlier. Maybe on the lingual shell it's better to use enamel shade, but that's okay. So the nice thing about the warmed composite and the Teflon tape in conjunction with each other is that we can just kind of inject this right on in. And I might just show y'all kind of a monochromatic just for the sake of time, but essentially what you can do at this point is you check on the lingual. See, we have a void on the lingual there, so we can't cure that yet, so we need to bring it down and fill in that void on the lingual. Which it looks like I'm pretty much there. Okay. Now on the facial, try to see if this light, that might help our lighting a little bit. So on the facial here, now we can come and we can start using our IPC to sculpt. And the wonderful thing about the Teflon tape is that you can build right up to the Teflon tape. No edge, no mylar, no matrix, no BioClear, no whatever. You just build right up to the Teflon tape. The only downside is that you need to make sure that your embrasures are really nicely formed before you cure, or else you're going to be doing a lot of cleanup, which is okay, but you know, I just like to make sure that I limit the amount of cleanup that I'm doing. So now when you come in here, we're missing composite on the bevel, where the bevel needs to be, but I'll cure this Dentin Shade, and then I don't have an enamel shade, but we'll pretend like it's an enamel shade once we get this other layer cured here. By the way, there's a good book if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you know, and there's a good book by Style Italiano called Colors. I think that's what it's called, Colors. I read that one. There's Fundamentals of Colors. That's more of a, that's another textbook. And shade matching. I think it's called Fundamentals of Color and Shade Matching or something. So use the IPC sideways to get the interproximal. Use it straight up like this to kind of shape the embrasure. And then turn it sideways, either like that or have it like that, in order to pat really nice soft taps to get it where you want it to go. So I'm going to cure this increment and then just add a little bit more there on the facial. So once you take the lingual index off, you can cure it through on both sides, because the composite itself has translucency to it on the lingual. And it's going to be overbooked at first, which is actually good. That's what kind of what we want, so that we can bring it back down to good contour. Kind of see what we have now. Okay, so we need to add just a little bit more up in this area. So we'll go ahead and do that. And really nicely warmed composite will just almost like flowable. It'll just flow right on. And it's easy to work with too. So a little bit, I'm going to pat it really nice and firmly, and we're going to over bulk just a little bit here, just to make sure that we cover that bevel. The key parts of this technique are a good lingual index, the Teflon tape, the composite warmer, get a good shade match, and being able to cure really well. So we're pretending like this is enamel shade in order to mimic the natural translucency of the tooth. And you want your enamel shade to be especially present on the kind of the outside areas of your prep in the periphery. Okay, that's decent. Another important thing on this is the rubber dam, which I don't have because I don't have any extra rubber dams laying around, but I actually got a new rubber dam clamp in the mail the other day, a 90N, which I'm looking forward to using. It's kind of like a 212, but anyway. So we'll cure this one more time, and then we'll do a little bit of finishing with the finishing burr. And I'm going to cheat. I mean, I'm going to look at it directly, but you guys are going to be using a mirror. And the cool thing about the Teflon tape is that when you're done with it, it pulls out, leaves a little bit of excess, don't worry about that, right into the inner proximal. But whenever you go in there with a floss or a sickle scaler, it'll come right out. So we'll do a little bit of, soft flex discs would probably be ideal for this part. So I'm actually going to use, I rarely use soft flex discs, but I'm going to use, for gross reduction here, I'm going to use some soft flex discs. Probably use a wide one. And remember on electric handpieces that the soft flex discs, the first two need to be on 10,000 RPM, or else you'll end up basically doing a crown prep on the tooth, because the plastic is really easy to cut. Okay. So gross reduction. Size of the ledge is a little long. So lining up the insides of edges here, lining up the distal insides of the corner, lining up the embrasure, facial surface, good finger rest. On the lingual, down in this corner here. Switch it to high speed a little bit here in order to get a good finish on that lingual. Okay, and if you zoom in, you can see a little bit of a void there on the incisal. Yeah, right there. So this is a good opportunity to demonstrate the power of flowable composite. So if you have a little void like this, what you can do, and you only discover it after you finish kind of shaping, you can go in, you can acid etch, place some adhesive or primer end adhesive, light cure it, and then add a little bit of flowable. Flowable just goes in, and this won't necessarily be on a load bearing area, so flowable will be okay. So we can just go in and add a little bit, just push. A little bit there, okay. And then you can use your Explorer or your Perio probe. I like the Perio probe actually, but you can use an Explorer too. This will tease it into the areas that you need it, and it'll avoid bonding it to the adjacent tooth. So you can replace the Mylar if you think you're going to go in here and bond a bunch of it to the adjacent tooth. In fact, if you're feeling really confident, what I'll do a lot of the times is whenever I'm doing class 3s, is even with this Teflon tape technique, I'll go in and I'll add flowable at the gingival aspect. Okay. And at this point, it's pretty much just like your class 3. All you need to do is make sure you go in and use the sickle scaler really well, you know, to clean up your gingival margin, and then this embrasure right here in order to get the contour nice. Same thing on the facial. I like using the sickle scaler more than the 12 blade because I don't like putting a scalpel in somebody's mouth unless I mean to cut their gums, which at first might happen if you use the 12 blade unjudiciously. So essentially at this point, it's just a matter of finishing and polishing in a normal manner, but that's the technique for class 4, for the filling. And the only downside to using the Teflon tape, if you're like me, I kind of plop it up against the adjacent tooth. The downside of that technique is very simple, is that it'll kind of hug the adjacent tooth. So instead of, you know, having a nice round contact on the adjacent tooth, what it tends to do is it kind of hugs a little bit like that. So you got to make sure you go in there and clean out those embrasures really well, which is okay. And you can either use a sickle scaler or a 201.3. You can really wedge the tooth nice and go in there with 7901 as well, or the 201.3 if you wedge the tooth really nice. And as I was showing a couple of you guys, to wedge the tooth, I don't think I have it with me. I have a waxing version, my waxing version. Obviously you can't do this on a patient, but if you go in here, stick this number 7 in here, it works really well.